Good afternoon, students. Today I am going to have a presentation, a lecture which is on public debt. This is the part of the fourth module which we are continuously engaging with. As a beginning point, let me introduce what is public debt and its meaning in India. Public debt refers to a part of total borrowing by the union government, which includes such items as market loans, special bearer bonds, treasury bills, and special loans and securities issued by RBI. It also includes the outstanding external debt, like a small saving, provident fund, other accounts, reserve funds, and deposits, etc. The aggregate borrowing by the union government comprising the public debt and these other borrowings are generally known as net liability of the government in that sense. So why do we actually need to have public debt is next question which we need to actually move. In that context, let me come to the objectives of the public debt. So, as I said, in India, most government debt is held in long-term interest-bearing securities such as national savings certificates, rural development bonds, capital development bonds, etc. So, in industrially advanced countries like United States, the term government or public debt refers to the accumulated amount of what government has borrowed to finance past deficits. So in such a country, the government debt has a very simple relationship to the government deficit. So this point is very important, and the increase in debt over a period, say 1 year, is equal to its current budgetary deficit. So every year's budgetary deficit is actually called the debt of the economy. But in India, the term is used in a very different sense, as I said earlier. So the state generally borrows from people to meet three kinds of expenditure. So to first one is to meet budget deficit, second one to meet the expense of war and other extraordinary situations such as pandemic, etc. So then it comes to the finance development activities, like different kinds of developmental activities and its finance. So let me come to one by one, and first the public debt to meet the budget deficit. It is not always proper to effect a change in the tax system whenever the public expenditure exceeds the public revenue. It is to be seen whether the transaction is casual or regular. So this point is very important, and if the budget deficit is casual, then it is proper to raise loans to meet the deficit. But if the deficit happens to be a regular feature every year, then the proper course for state to be to raise further revenue by taxation or reduce its expenditure. So this is how we need to be understood, the problem. Now the second issue is called the public debt to meet emergencies like wars, other health hazards, etc. Especially when we are in the time of a pandemic, this is very important, and whether the government is doing accordingly is also part of its responsibility. In many countries, the existing public debt therefore is to a great extent on account of war expense, particularly. Especially after World War II, this type of public debt had considerably increased. A large portion of public debt in India has been incurred to defray the expense of the lost war. So this is how it's been considered. And then we move to the other issues like the pandemic financing, where there also the government has to do, it is actually having a responsibility to deal with such sort of an expenditure. Then comes to the third problem, like the public debt for development purposes. So during British rule in India, public debt had to be raised to construct railway, irrigation projects and other works In the post-independence era, the government borrows from public to meet the cost of development work under the five-year plans and other projects. But when the Niti Aayog came up, and then the five-year plan and plan itself is in under crossroad, then this process is in fact being compromised, or at least for reasons which is the central government aspires to. As a result, the volume of public debt in the early period increase, and then later period I think we need to be really think of, because whether we are having so far the public debt never come down. So in that sense we can simply say that planning is actually increases the debt in that sense. So things need to be really understood properly, and based on the empirics only we can speak on this aspect. So I'll come to that problems in a while in the next lectures and all, not in this lecture. But what I am going to do today is a little bit to understand a little bit on the debt and its formal theories, and the substituting factors or constituting elements of how public debt been rationalized, etc. So then what are the theoretical and empirical backup for the argument for and against the public debt? So this is how normally we need to understand as a preliminary lecture on the public debt. So given the Indian context, let me come to the theoretical aspect of what is public debt in that sense. So the role of state was restricted within the limit of some minimum function. That was the view of classical economists, who believed that laissez-faire policy, the state function, that is the state function, should minimum, and the government had to maintain only internal law and order, defense from the external aggression, and look after some public works, etc. So this is what is largely comprises the second category which we had discussed in the public debt component a while ago. Because this is largely a security measure which the government has to get money and being spent, but not the third, which is the developmental aspect, or the other first in that sense is really need to be addressed by the state, or budgetary deficit in that. Because if the government is only taking care of the policing activities or the security aspect, then they don't really plan. So the first and third is not actually been discussed in that context here. So that is why in the classicals, those who believe that full employment exists in the economy and there is a perfect competition and a mobility of factors of production in the market, they had more belief in individualism and felt that self-interest leads to national interest. So this is in fact classical Adam Smithian understanding that if every individual works, then the society works very well. But theoretically, this point being refuted later, and I'll come to that after finishing this point. Okay, so there is no need of government intervention this smooth if the individual work perfectly smooth going economic activities, and if any calamity befalls, it will brought to equilibrium point. So this is a kind of actually the self-restoration point, or the ability of the individual or the system is being highlighted here. But we know that from the public economics perspective, or the structure of the macroeconomic understanding per se, the very origin is actually a departure from this particular point. So the automatic reinstation, or the reinstallation of the equilibrium is doubtful for very many reasons. In that sense, when the government is performing minimum function, then there arises no question of huge public expenditure, and for that no need of a large public. This argument is there, linchpin in that sense. So further government did not require rising funds in the form of public debt also. So in addition to this, they said that the government expenditure is wasteful and unproductive. So this is what is the argument of the classicals, as the supply of money is fixed. So this is the way in which they try to emphasize, and the supply of the money is fixed. Any amount that is transferred to the government will be at the cost of the private employment, and the private expenditure and the funds so borrowed will be withdrawn from the productive uses and will be put into unproductive channels. So that means the overall fund has been available with the individual and the government right to basically invest upon anything, then that is actually pull out the funds of the private individual, or the availability of funds for the private individual. So therefore, there is this is actually leading to the argument of the crowding out. In fact, for a single lecture which I am going to discuss about the crowding in and out in the real world. So I am not going to the details of the crowding out here. So in a nutshell, this is what is the argument which was put forth by the classicals in that sense. Then as a following from the classical understanding, there is a new classical theory of public debt, which is also put forth, which was put forth by largely by E.C. Pigou. So what is Pigou particularly identified with this sort of an understanding is on the welfare aspect, or the welfare theory of public debt. So in his economics of welfare, so he said that the main motive of economic study is to help social improvement. That is, the concept of ideal output was central. Okay, so this is what does he want to talk about. Pigou defined it as a composition of production such that no alternative output which could be obtained by means of reallocation among the various industries of the economy's resource would be itself achieved ideal output. So if and only if, when a private market relation departs from ideal output, then state intervention was justified. So this is the position which was in fact taken by AC Pigou. I'll repeat this. This is because it is very important. The concept of ideal output was central according to Pigou. So he is of the view that the production such that no alternative output which could be obtained by means of reallocation among the various industries of economy, its resources would be itself achieved ideal output. So that is the whole point which he was trying to. This is the point only when you basically justify the ideal output. So otherwise, they justify the government intervention to have the ideal output. So this is the kind of departure. So the state's interest is very important as far as this new theory. But state interest is actually welfaristic rather than simply, as a, policeman. As a policeman or the security, there is much more. Security is only secures, but the welfare aspect of the people's well-being is also the consideration of the state being incorporated in this kind of understanding, which is later called the neoclassical theory of public debt. So the classical and neoclassical theories of public debt need to be there for a thorough review in this regard, because the stream of thought belief, especially the classical stream of thought, believed or grounded in the laissez-faire understanding, and in fact in the neoclassical economics too subscribe to this view, though in a diluted version. So the non-interventions of the state policy, believe in self-adjusting mechanism of free market system, led them to limit the role of state activity to police state or regulatory functions such as defense of the country, maintenance of internal law and order through civil and police administration, and dispensation of justice and contractual obligation. That is, these are the kind of things which basically made them to function. So they also on a limited scale supported public works. In the classical sense also this is there. Therefore it has been rationalized and justified in the new classical understanding, especially the welfareistic modality of the state government to intervene and take the draw the money and spend the money. So this is the welfareistic effect and beneficial effect on the private industry, trade and commerce, etc. So any other function relating to industry, say industry, trade and commerce performed by the state government was considered an encroachment in the private initiative, which I have said earlier as the crowding. They were afraid of their situation in which the crowding out happened. So it was also uncalled following the possibility of a full employment through free market forces and inefficiencies for the state government as a corporate body lacks stake in the economic functions unlike the private person. So in that context, in the classical and the neoclassical understanding, the state is largely with the confinement that they cannot simply intervene into the policies of the state in a nutshell, whereas they just act as actually an outsider taking care of things without involving much of the activity of the institution. So in that sense, the security, nothing else in that. So the welfare concerned security, nothing else. That is what is called the state. But that kind of state is in fact not a state at all. That is what is real world. State is actually having its own power within it, which is antithetical to the understanding of the state as well as the other disciplines of the social science is concerned. So economics discipline in that sense is too simplistic and too idealistic about its people. Then the very question of the existence of the state and even the state as a police is not actually being justified. Where comes the newer understanding and the theoretical as well as the empirical points amounts to the newer theoretical frameworks, such as we call it as modern theory of public debt in that sense. So what is the modern theory of public debt? So the economic philosophy of public debt in modern finance shows a radical departure from the laissez-faire notion. The situation changed after a Great Depression of 1930s to a great extent. The classical theory of public debt had absolutely collapsed, which had taken for granted the full employment and unproductiveness of public expenditure. So this is the key point in which we need to really thrust upon, because in the classical case, people were being worried about the very kind of the existence of the full employment situation, which is in fact a problematic statement. The classical antagonism of the public debt in fact is something to do with the granted full employment, was based on the assumptions basically. So that is those that the followers of Keynes taken into account the income generating aspect of public debt and rejected any possibility of internal debt being burdened upon the community. So this is quite clear that the former in fact stressed upon the fact that it is always the expenditure cannot have a positive effect on the total or the very functioning of the economy. But this was literally being rejected by Keynesians or the followers of Keynes and general theory particularly. So the Keynesian attack on the classical principle of budgeting and public finance was logical extension of the Keynesian attack on the view that economy tends to equilibrium at full employment. Keynes assumed that if there were unemployed resources which the private sector could not employ, these resources can be put into use or put to use by the unbalancing the budget, So Keynes held the view that increase in public debt through the multiple effect would raise the national income in that sense. So he linked public borrowing with the deficit financing and authorized the government to borrow for all purpose so that effective demand in the economy is increased, resulting in increased employment and output. So he did not draw any demarcation between the productive and unproductive expenditures, the classical said, because he said that there is no point in that sense to argue, because Keynesian borrowing for consumption was as desirable as borrowing for investment in that, because we've already seen that the multiplier of the investment is as good as, or the accelerator of the consumption driven demand, and its acceleration is as good as the multiplier, which is actually the investment. So Keynes borrowing for consumption was as desirable as borrowing for investment in productive goods, because consumption expenditure induce investment too in that sense. Therefore the investment will rise because of the induced consumption expenditure induced demand. So Keynesian analysis reached its culmination in Abapilerna's functional finance argument. That is, this view government revenue and expenditure and government debt solely as an instrument for the control of community expenditure. That is what he was actually arguing for. So these were merely the tool to achieve the goal of stable employment. So what is the point? The stabilization of the employment is actually the objective in that sense, and it is all the tool in which we adopt to have this sort of an objective. So tax and expenditure were to be increased or decreased in that sense. So safely to affect the national rate of spending, debt instrument were to be sold to the public to absorb their idle balance and redeem to increase liquidity in times of depression. So this is the argument which is largely put forward by the functional finance argument, under the functional finance argument by Lerner. So the functional finance theory holds that the absolute size of the national debt does not matter at all, and that however large the interest payment that have to be made, these do not constitute any burden upon the society as a whole. So the own burden thesis also gives importance to certain advantage of public borrowing in that sense. So the economic effect of public debt should be assessed in the light of the nature of the expenditure for which debt is incurred and in terms of its income generating potentiality. So the modern theory gives importance to the net burden of public debt. The theory further states that additional flow of income generated by the increased debt financed expenditure facilitates the payment of taxes to serve the debt. So this is what is actually the argument. The theory states in a nutshell that the income generated by increased debt financed financed expenditure facilitate the payment of taxes to serve the debt. So modern theory also states that public borrowing promotes the development of more and more institutionalized sources of saving, like banks, stocks, and capital market in that sense. So somebody can also argue that the insurance companies too involved in that sense. So what is fundamentally the importance of this argument vis-a-vis the public the data arguments of the classical or the neoclassical? It is in fact says that the government do play a very, very important role in order to whatever in order to basically improve the conditions, the situations in or situations of equilibrium or whatever. So that means the growth, if somebody to put it differently, if somebody argues that we need to have growth, then it is also the government's intervention do have a positive effect in that sense. So this is what is the most important point Especially when you argue too much for the spontaneity, this position makes its own deviation and importance in that sense. However, there are many sides from different sides and angle. People do had criticism against this view. For example, James Buchanan called this modern theory of public debt as the new orthodoxy, so which according to him is based on three basic assumptions, because as I pointed out that in the modern theory there are also certain assumptions. So in the critique against the modern critique on modern theory debt put forth by James Buchanan stresses the following fact, that the creation of public debt does not involve any transfer of the primary real burden to future generation. So he said that this is not actually going to have a transfer of the primary real burden to the future generation thesis. So then second one, the analogy between private debt and public debt is wrong. Okay. And the third one, there is a sharp and important distinction between an internal debt and an external debt in that sense. So James Buchanan's public principle of public debt in 1958, in fact, challenged the modern theories or theory or view that is public debt is no burden on the economy, and no matter how financed cannot be shifted to future generation. So that means what James Buchanan and his cohort later argue that there is going to be a serious effect, that you are going to basically shift the same thing into the future. So later James Mead and Musgrave too agreed that Buchanan's idea, that is, there is an intergenerational problem of debt. That is, one generation's commitment will have an effect on the next generation in that sense. But we will come to this point later, because one generation's positive effect on the change in social order has definitely a positive effect on the next generation. Then it will not be, in that sense, is basically a very big deal. So we need to really carefully understand this particular argument that is Buchanan tried to prove. So in that sense, again, let me be very simple, that what Buchanan tried to prove, that in the most general case, the primary real burden of public debt is shifted to future generation. Second, the analysis between public debt and private debt is fundamentally correct. And third, the external debt and internal debt are fundamentally equivalent. So these are the 3 points which Buchanan tried to stress upon. That is, the intergenerational burden will be or it will be a reality if you argue for the other thing. So then burden, when you say that the burden, then you also has to say that there is a benefit in that. So, but that portion I'll discuss in a while, that how it is being tweaked in that sense. So but the other 2 points, that the public debt and private debt is fundamentally correct. There is also a problem, that is whether the public debt and private debt is one and the same or not. So, and the third one is the internal and external differences of debt. So in the public principle, let me come to what is the basic points of Buchanan in that sense. So the principles of public debt, Professor Buchanan gave his own definition, that the future generation. So the future generation of the modern theory is different to that of the future generation of what James Buchanan argued. He takes a future generation as any set of individuals living in any time period, following that in which the debt is created. So what is this? So the actual length of the time period per se is not equivalent. If we choose a period of 1 year, and if we further call the year in which the borrowing or period take place 2, then individual living in any one of the year T1 to Tn are defined as living in future generation. Okay, so an individual living in the year 2 will formally be living in the year but he is different individual in the two times. That is the first year, suppose if I am being paid in the first year, and the second year of me is different to that of the first year of me, okay, where I paid the amount. So in the second generation and first generation is actually being understood in that sense. So one person's whole life period itself is comes and categorized as the future generation, the same person in that sense. So this is what is roughly was making. So an individual living, therefore, I shall not be concerned as to whether a public debt is transferred to our children or grandchildren and so on, and I shall be concerned with whether or not the debt can be postponed. So this is what is actually the view that is what is Buchanan's point, that is he's not in fact worried about whether this is given to the children or the future. But he is forgetting the fact that the T1 period where I am actually loosed off is having also a positive where if I get any better off in T1 period or a Tn period. So that point is actually is being silent here. So any growth, for example, in that sense, that is every point of T1 to Tn, if there is no growth of that particular individual, then this argument has well and good in that sense. Otherwise, there is a problem to understand primarily the argument. That is whether this concept of Buchanan has trying to refute the primary burden of public debt cannot be shifted forward. The New Orthodoxy argue that the burden is borne by the generation living at the time of the debt creation, because it is the generation which sacrifices its goods and services and transfer the same from private employment to the hands of the government. However, Buchanan contradicts it on the ground that the contribution to a voluntary loan involves no sacrifice. So at least from the theoretical point, this last point is very important. That is, he contradicts on the ground that the contribution to a voluntary loan involves no sacrifice. So if an individual freely chooses to purchase a government bond, he is presumably moving to a preferred position on his utility surface. By so doing, nobody can actually say that he is actually sacrificing it. He has improved, not worsened. He is allowed by the transaction in that sense. So whatever the argument in that sense is typical only in. Therefore, it is meaningless to argue that the future generation cannot come. The future burden is being shifted, whether it is intergenerational or the same period the person is actually phases, but at the same time the same benefit portion of the same person's lifetime is always been silenced by this particular argument. It is only talking about burden in that sense. But same the case with the intergeneration also. Therefore, the position of the Keynesians are more or less consistent. They said that every year you are improving. Your improvement this itself is a mark of whether you need to pay or not. So the public economic theorist and all who is against this public understanding, I'm not seeing that there is any point in that sense to argue for them. Because if you say that there is no point of government, there is no necessary, then what kind of public economics you're talking about, or what public economics you are? If I would say that I am a microeconomics, but I refute microeconomics, then how can I be a microeconomist in that sense? So if I don't subscribe any of the macroeconomic argument and any of the theoretical positions, any of the result of the theoretical position, then how could one call himself or herself as a microeconomist, or any economist who say that I'm not an economist? And how can one be an economist by refuting the fact that he's not an economist or she is not an economist? So in a similar line, you can also see that the argument put forth by Buchanan in that sense is a little bit problematic. So with this understanding, let me conclude. Let me actually stop the lecture by saying that, if you subscribe the importance of the government, if you subscribe the importance of the financing of the government, then it definitely have all positive effect, as well as you may be also having a negative effect. But at the same time, in the time immemorial or the current position, current government and all, we do have the same problem that, some can actually, take away all the private saving as their own saving in the name of government. At the same time, the reverse also being practiced in an empirical world. So I think, with this point, let me conclude my introductory lecture on public debt, and I'll be coming to the other topics in the next lecture. Thank you very much for your patient listening in that sense.